Stay in your lane, Eleanor. Victor Thorne's voice cut across the open-plan office, dripping with condescension as he waved a dismissive hand. Eleanor Vance felt the familiar heat rise, a slow burn of fury she'd spent years mastering, but this time, it was different. He'd just ripped apart months of her meticulous compliance, work on the federal contract, blindly trusting his gut. Asterisk, stay in my lane? Asterisk, she thought, her gaze sharpening on the chaos he'd unleashed. He had no idea what storm he'd just invited. The metallic tang of the corporate elevator lingered, but the sting of Victor Thorne's dismissive smile, his casual stay in your lane, was far sharper. Eleanor Vance, head of compliance, felt a familiar, cold burn ignite deep within. Her gaze, usually serene, now sharpened to an almost surgical precision, dissecting the path of professional destruction Victor, the freshly minted VP of Sales, was forging. He'd barely been in his opulent corner office a month, yet already, the meticulous frameworks she'd spent years constructing for the upcoming federal contract, the bedrock of their biggest annual revenue, were being systematically dismantled. Victor's methodology was simple: slash, burn, and self-aggrandize. He'd swept into the department like a hurricane, rebranding Eleanor's existing, legally sound proposals as bloated and stifling innovation. He'd unilaterally stripped out critical compliance clauses, the very safeguards that had kept the company in good standing with federal agencies for decades. Her carefully cultivated relationships with procurement officers, built on trust and a flawless record, were now circumvented by Victor's loud, backslapping overtures and ill-informed promises. She was summarily excluded from every critical discussion, her emails about regulatory risks ignored, her presence in meetings dismissed with a wave of his hand or a condescending, "Don't worry your pretty little head, Eleanor, I've got this handled." Each slight was a fresh indignity, a further chipping away at her quiet authority. She, who had been the unseen architect, the invisible backbone ensuring multi-million-dollar deals sailed through audits, was now relegated to the role of an ignored Cassandra, watching the ship slowly take on water. The inevitable came with a suffocating swiftness. 3 weeks after Victor unilaterally submitted his streamlined version of the federal contract, the initial rejection landed like a lead weight in the CEO's inbox. Not just a request for revisions, but a formal warning from the Federal Procurement Agency, citing grave noncompliance and threatening immediate blacklisting from future bids. The company, teetering on the precipice of losing its most lucrative deal, was suddenly facing a catastrophic blow. Panic rippled through the C-suite, a flurry of emails and hushed conversations that somehow never implicated Victor directly. Eleanor was eventually summoned, not by Victor, but by Mr. Sterling, the CEO, his face a mask of strained composure. "Eleanor," he began, his voice tight, this is a mess. Victor's enthusiasm seems to have overstepped. "I need you to fix it." Quietly. There was no mention of accountability for Victor, no acknowledgement of Eleanor's prior warnings. Just the expectation that she, the silent fixer, would once again clean up someone else's debris, without credit, without a voice. The familiar frustration, a dull ache that had become an unwelcome companion for years, flared into a controlled, internal inferno. She imagined the usual path, documenting Victor's incompetence, appealing to HR, making a direct case to Mr. Sterling. But a decade of quiet observation had taught her the futility of such conventional measures in this company. She'd seen brilliant colleagues consumed by similar battles, ultimately leaving, their integrity intact, but their careers stymied. No, this time, simply fixing it quietly wasn't enough. The bitter taste of being consistently overlooked and undermined finally solidified into an unwavering resolve. Her gaze drifted to the framed corporate charter on her wall, a document she knew better than her own reflection. Within its dense legalese, and within the labyrinthine federal regulations she'd mastered, lay not just the solution to the federal contract, but the blueprint for Victor's undoing. This wouldn't be a rescue mission. It would be a strategic dismantling. She would, indeed, stay in her lane, and that lane was about to become a one-way path to Victor Thorne's professional demise. Eleanor didn't just walk away from the CEO's office, she stalked. The casual dismissal, the implicit expectation that she, the fixer, would once again clean up Victor's mess, had ignited a cold, steady flame within her. This wasn't fury that screamed, but one that plotted. The company's immediate salvation was merely a byproduct of her true objective, the methodical, utterly silent obliteration of Victor Thorne's undeserved corporate reign. She returned to her cubicle, the fluorescent lights humming an indifferent tune, and ignored the sympathetic glances from a few junior analysts. The urgency of the federal contract hung heavy, a ticking time bomb Victor had set. But for Eleanor, the immediate deadline was less important than the foundational flaw she intended to expose. She spent the rest of the day in a blur of focused efficiency, clearing her trivial compliance tasks with a speed that masked the tempest brewing beneath. As the office emptied, its usual drone fading into the occasional squeak of a janitor's cart, Eleanor remained. She flipped open her specialized access terminal, bypassing the usual corporate portals, delving into the deep archives of federal procurement regulations. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, a dance born of years navigating labyrinthine legal texts. She wasn't looking for a quick fix, she was searching for the unfixable flaw, the systemic vulnerability that, once triggered, would cascade through Victor's carefully constructed facade. Hours bled into late night. Coffee mugs accumulated on her desk, silent witnesses to her unwavering concentration. She sifted through countless pages of the Federal Acquisition Regulation, FAR, then moved to the specific agency's supplementary policies, the denser, less-read sections that few bothered with. Section after section, paragraph after paragraph, her sharp eyes scanned for anomalies, for clauses designed to protect the integrity of the process from individuals precisely like Victor. Then, amidst the mind-numbing jargon, a phrase glimmered. Tucked away in a seldom-referenced appendix to the agency's procurement handbook, a faint digital outline of an almost-forgotten policy update, she found it, Section 11, paragraph 6.3. The words swam into focus, then solidified into a potent weapon. Individuals with a documented history of federal ethics censures or findings of material misrepresentation in previous federal procurement engagements are hereby deemed ineligible for active roles in federal contract negotiation, signatory approval, or direct oversight. A small, almost imperceptible tremor ran through Eleanor. This wasn't just a clause, it was an interdiction. Her mind, already a steel trap of corporate history, immediately leaped to the vague rumors, the hushed whispers from years ago, about Victor Thorne's rapid departure from a mid-level government contracting firm. A reorganization, he'd called it. A strategic pivot. Eleanor had dismissed it then as typical corporate puffery. Now it was a siren call. The hunt shifted. From federal databases, her focus narrowed to internal company records. HR archives. Victor Thorne's hiring packet. She knew the company's HR system like the back of her hand, having audited it countless times. It took another 2 grueling hours, digging through digital folders tagged historical onboarding and decommissioned personnel files before she located it. An old, faded scan of a background check from almost a decade ago, buried deep within a forgotten subdirectory. There, nestled among glowing references and inflated accomplishments, was the damning addendum, a brief, almost anemic summary of a minor federal ethics censure regarding undisclosed interests and a subsequent administrative settlement from his previous role. It was enough. More than enough. The quiet click of her mouse echoed in the silent office. This wasn't merely a loophole, it was a strategically placed tripwire, buried deep and forgotten, now exposed by her relentless precision. Victor Thorne wasn't just incompetent, he was fundamentally, legally ineligible to have ever touched the federal deal, let alone to spearhead the renegotiation. The gravity of her discovery settled over her, not as a weight, but as a surge of profound, cold power. She didn't hesitate. Her gaze flickered to the contact list on her screen. Office of Ethics, Federal Procurement Agency. A direct line, one she rarely used, but its authority was absolute. With a steady hand, she dialed. The phone rang 3 times before a crisp, professional voice answered. "This is Eleanor Vance, Corporate Compliance, Thorncorp. I need to speak with Director Evans or her deputy. This concerns the ongoing federal contract renegotiation, and I'll be exercising my board-delegated authority as interim signatory, effective immediately, to rectify some procedural oversights." Her voice was calm, utterly devoid of emotion, yet each word carried the weight of years of suppressed confidence. She didn't wait for questions, anticipating them with a practiced ease, outlining the urgent need for a direct, discreet intervention. She laid out the facts, withholding the specific details of Victor's ineligibility for now, but establishing her unassailable position to take command. As she spoke, she could almost feel the gears of bureaucracy, slow and cumbersome, beginning to turn in her favor, completely bypassing Victor Thorne, who was, at that very moment, probably asleep, dreaming of his next undeserved promotion. The game had changed. The rules, however, had always been there, just waiting for the right architect to find them. The fluorescent hum of the deserted office after midnight had become Eleanor Vance's unwitting accomplice. The stale air, typically thick with the scent of ambition and desperation, now offered a crisp canvas for her silent machinations. With the federal deal's critical clauses stripped bare by Victor Thorne's careless hand, Eleanor began the painstaking process of reweaving the complex tapestry of compliance. Each word, each comma, each cross-referenced section of the agency's procurement policy was a thread in her growing web. She reinstated the ethical safeguards Victor had deemed unnecessary red tape, the risk assessment protocols he'd labeled pessimistic, and the detailed scope of work that had been whittled down to a marketing brochure's bullet points. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, a silent ballet of focused fury, restoring not just the deal's integrity, but her own sense of purpose. She knew she couldn't work entirely alone. Her quiet network, cultivated over years of selfless assistance and unheralded expertise, was her next move. First, Sarah from procurement, whose meticulous record-keeping and aversion to chaos made her a natural ally. Eleanor's email was brief, devoid of alarm, simply requesting specific, obscure historical expenditure data that would subtly support the reinstated clauses. Sarah, accustomed to Eleanor's precise needs, sent the files within the hour, no questions asked. Next, Marcus from IT security, a quiet, observant man who understood the vulnerability of data better than anyone. Eleanor needed a secure, off-site server to house the burgeoning volume of sensitive documentation, bypassing company servers where Victor's eager minions might inadvertently or deliberately stumble. Marcus, after a single, knowing glance, set it up. Lastly, Lena from finance, a woman who spoke the language of numbers with ruthless clarity. Eleanor shared the projected financial liabilities Victor's initial draft would have incurred, contrasting them with her revised, compliant figures. Lena's sharp intake of breath was all the confirmation Eleanor needed. A quiet alliance had been forged. None of them needed to know the full extent of her plan, only their part in shoring up the crumbling edifice Victor had created. The real linchpin, however, was Isabella Rossi. An external federal contract attorney, Isabella operated with the detached precision of a surgeon. Over encrypted video calls, Eleanor laid out the framework of the renegotiated deal, walking Isabella through every nuance of the federal agency's demands and the subtle ways Victor had undermined them. Isabella, her sharp eyes missing nothing, nodded slowly, impressed by Eleanor's comprehensive understanding. "This isn't just good, Eleanor," Isabella observed. "This is watertight. But, given the internal politics you're hinting at, you need more than watertight. You need a deterrent. A consequence." It was then, under Isabella's expert guidance, that the landmine clause took shape. Eleanor had identified Section 14.2b, a standard clause regarding signatory authority. Isabella proposed an amplification. They meticulously crafted an addendum, discreetly embedded within the dense legal text, transforming it into a devastating trap. This amplified Clause 14.2b now stipulated that any removal or reassignment of the named signatory, Eleanor Vance, from her role in managing this specific federal contract within 90 days post-execution would trigger two immediate and severe repercussions: an automatic, comprehensive client audit of all company contracts and, more critically, the assignment of full personal financial liability for any resulting penalties directly to the approving executive body responsible for such removal. It was a poison pill, a legal guillotine designed to make the board think twice, then thrice, about disrupting her authority. As Eleanor perfected her invisible trap, Victor Thorne continued his grand, oblivious charade. He breezed through the office, a whirlwind of manufactured importance, boasting loudly about streamlining the federal deal, completely unaware that his so-called streamlining had nearly blacklisted the company. He spent his days in long, performative phone calls, his voice echoing from his corner office about innovative strategies and synergistic paradigms, while Eleanor, just 2 floors down, was actually saving the company from his incompetence. He hosted lavish lunches with junior staff, charming them with promises of advancement, completely missing the quiet, knowing glances exchanged between Sarah, Marcus, and Lena when his name came up. His laughter, loud and self-satisfied, often drifted through the halls, a stark, irritating counterpoint to the meticulous, silent work that was about to bring his carefully constructed facade crashing down. He was a performer on a stage, unaware that the stage itself was being subtly undermined, piece by painstakingly placed piece, by the very architect he so blithely ignored. The digital chime from her secured line was a rare disruption. Sarah, from the finance department, sounded frayed. Eleanor, the board is agitated. They want this federal deal closed yesterday. Sterling's projections are wildly optimistic, and his last presentation bordered on nonsensical. There are whispers, not quite complaints, but a definite sense of urgency to finalize this before he truly implodes it. Sarah's voice dropped. Look, I know he's your VP, but everyone can see it. Just get it done, please. Eleanor listened, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor of satisfaction rippling through her. Victor's incompetence, a festering wound she'd long warned about, was finally drawing blood, albeit not yet publicly. His bro-culture charm and superficial vision selling had momentarily fooled the board, but even their short-sightedness couldn't ignore the mounting financial red flags. This wasn't just about Victor anymore. It was about the systemic dismissal of her warnings, the company's own complicity in allowing such a charlatan to helm a critical deal. Now, they were unconsciously begging her to clean up their mess, positioning her precisely where she needed to be. She opened the secure folder containing the long-forgotten Board Resolution 2017, C4. It was a relic from a crisis several years prior, granting specific, temporary signatory authority to the head of compliance for high-stakes federal contracts if the divisional VP was deemed incapacitated or unavailable. The wording was archaic, the circumstances specific, but the resolution had never been formally rescinded. Victor wasn't technically incapacitated, but his demonstrable incompetence and the board's clear anxiety fulfilled the spirit of unavailability in Eleanor's meticulously analytical mind. It was a lever buried deep, waiting for a hand competent enough to find it. Working late into the night, powered by cold coffee and a quiet fury, Eleanor meticulously revised the sprawling federal contract. She stripped away Victor's bluster and vague promises, reintroducing critical indemnity triggers that would shield the company from his initial, reckless commitments. She tightened the language, anchored every clause to federal regulations, and wove in the protections Victor had so carelessly omitted. Each keystroke was a silent affirmation of her expertise, a defiant counterpoint to every patronizing dismissal she'd endured. Then, the true masterpiece. With Isabella Rossi on an encrypted call, her federal contract attorney's voice calm and guiding, Eleanor crafted Clause 14.2b. It was deceptively simple, nestled deep within the boilerplate. Should the named signatory of this contract, Eleanor Vance, be removed from her position, transferred, or otherwise prevented from fulfilling her oversight duties regarding this federal agreement within 90 calendar days of its execution, an immediate, Independent federal compliance audit shall be initiated. Furthermore, any resultant financial liabilities or penalties arising from such audit shall be assigned personally to the approving executive body that sanctioned said removal or interference, irrespective of corporate indemnification. Isabella's faint smile through the video call was approving. That, Eleanor, she said, is not just a golden parachute. It's a legal landmine. They try to cut you out after this, they'll detonate their own careers. You've just made yourself indispensable, in the most painful way possible for them. Eleanor leaned back, the screen's glow reflecting in her sharp eyes. Indispensable. Not because they recognized her value, but because the cost of not having her would be too high for them to bear personally. The ticking clock had begun, and the unsuspecting executives were now standing directly on the bomb. The air in the executive boardroom was thick with an acidic blend of panic and disbelief. Victor Thorne, his tailored suit now seemed a costume too large for his rapidly deflating bravado, slumped in his chair, eyes darting from the grim faces of the board members to the meticulously organized binder in Mr. Sterling's hand. The legal counsel, a severe woman named Ms. Albright, cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the tense silence like a scalpel. "Gentlemen and Ms. Vance," she began, her gaze briefly settling on the empty seat that would have been Eleanor's, the federal contract, Exhibit A, Section 14.2b, as amended and executed by Ms. Vance yesterday states, any unilateral removal or reassignment of the designated primary signatory, Eleanor Vance, from this federal procurement project within 90 calendar days following the execution date shall immediately trigger a comprehensive, independent client audit of all prior federal contracts approved under the executive body responsible for such removal. Furthermore, such action will assign direct and personal financial liability to the approving executive officers for any subsequent breach of compliance or resulting contractual penalties identified during said audit. A collective gasp, swiftly stifled, rippled through the room. Faces, previously etched with annoyance, now contorted in a dawning horror. Mr. Davies, the head of finance, visibly paled, his hand instinctively going to loosen his tie. They weren't just risking the company's reputation, they were risking their personal fortunes. Eleanor had made sure of it. Victor finally found his voice a reedy, desperate sound. This is preposterous. I was never informed of such an amendment. This is a malicious act, a conspiracy to undermine my authority. His attempt at indignant bluster faltered, his eyes pleading. Mr. Sterling, the board chair, a man whose patience had always been as thin as parchment where incompetence was concerned, slammed his hand flat on the mahogany table. The sharp crack echoed. Silence, Victor. You were in charge of this division. You dismissed Ms. Vance, you oversaw the contract. Your ignorance is not a defense, it is a damning indictment of your negligence. Are we to believe you didn't even read the contract you were supposedly managing? His voice was cold, lethal. The ensuing debate was brief, brutal. The board members, united by the sudden, terrifying prospect of personal financial ruin, moved with uncharacteristic speed. A motion for Victor Thorne's immediate suspension pending a full review of his conduct and qualifications was proposed. It passed unanimously, the swiftness a testament to Eleanor's carefully placed landmine. Victor, utterly broken, could only watch as his carefully constructed facade imploded around him. Miles away, in her quiet apartment, Eleanor scrolled through an email on her tablet. It was from Mr. Sterling himself, carbon copying the entire board. It began with effusive apologies and then extended a formal offer, a newly created role, Strategic Compliance Advisory Lead, a highly compensated, autonomous position with quarterly advisory rights directly to the board. It was everything she had ostensibly worked for and more. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. She considered the offer for a moment, picturing the scramble, the frantic damage control. They were desperate, exposed. They needed her. But they hadn't valued her before the crisis, had they? They hadn't protected her from Victor, only tasked her to clean up his mess. Her fingers moved deftly across the screen. She didn't accept. She didn't even negotiate. Her reply was terse, to the point, Thank you for the offer. I am open to discussing a consulting arrangement remotely under terms more reflective of the specialized, time-sensitive expertise required. My rates for such an engagement would, of course, be adjusted accordingly. She pressed send. The message was clear. Her power was no longer derived from a title, but from her indispensable knowledge and the leverage she'd so carefully built. The company didn't just need her, they would have to earn her on her terms. The game was over, and Eleanor Vance had just reset the rules. The air in the executive boardroom was thick with a panic so potent, it tasted metallic on the tongue. Victor Sterling, usually radiating an insufferable sheen of confidence, was a deflated caricature of himself, his expensive suit rumpled, a sheen of sweat beading on his forehead despite the aggressively cool air conditioning. His eyes darted between the grim faces of the board members, each one an open wound of accusation and fear. The news of Eleanor Vance's direct contract execution and Director Santiago's damning email had ripped through the corporate facade, exposing a raw nerve of incompetence and potential disaster. Victor, can you explain why Ms. Vance's signature is on a federal contract that you assured us was pending your final review? Demanded Mr. Harrison, the chairman, his voice dangerously low. Victor stammered. She acted unilaterally. A rogue agent. I had everything under control, almost ready to sign. She usurped my authority, Chairman. His voice cracked, a pathetic echo of his former swagger. Usurped your authority, interjected Ms. Albright, head of legal, her gaze chilling. Or simply executed the deal you failed to close, after she diligently provided the framework you ignored for months? The discussion quickly spiraled into a furious dissection of Victor's abysmal performance, the federal deal's near collapse, and the embarrassing public exposure. But the true bombshell was yet to drop. It came when Isabella Rossi, Eleanor's external counsel, was invited to clarify the contractual language. With a calm, professional demeanor, she walked the board through the renegotiated terms, finally landing on Section 14.2b. This clause, introduced by Ms. Vance and fully compliant with federal guidelines, Isabella explained, her voice cutting through the tense silence, stipulates that any attempt to remove the named signatory, Ms. Eleanor Vance, from her primary operational role related to this contract within 90 days of its execution would trigger an immediate, independent federal audit. Furthermore, it assigns personal financial liability for any resulting penalties or lost revenue directly to the executive body that approved such a removal, and to any officer found to have knowingly misrepresented facts or obstructed due diligence regarding the signatory's qualifications. A collective gasp swept through the room. Faces drained of color as the full weight of Eleanor's meticulous trap settled upon them. It wasn't just the deal. It was their personal fortunes, their reputations, and their very careers on the line. Victor, pale and visibly trembling, tried to protest, but his words dissolved into incoherent sputtering. He had not merely been outmaneuvered, he had been utterly annihilated. Eleanor, who had been observing the proceedings from a discreet video conference link, her face impassive, watched as the chairman's eyes met hers on the screen. The fear in his gaze was palpable. There was no more pretense of dismissal or condescension. Ms. Vance, Mr. Harrison began, his tone now deferential. This is a regrettable situation. We understand the critical role you've played. The board has voted unanimously to immediately suspend Mr. Sterling, pending a full internal investigation. He paused, then continued, his voice bordering on pleading. We'd like to offer you an immediate promotion, perhaps a newly created advisory role with expanded responsibilities, reporting directly to me, to oversee the successful implementation of this vital contract. What do you say? Eleanor's response was immediate and unwavering, delivered with a quiet strength that belied her years of corporate invisibility. Thank you, Chairman Harrison. However, I must decline your offer for an advisory role, as currently structured. Silence descended, heavy and absolute. The board members stared, aghast. She wasn't just fixing their mess, she was walking away from their golden handcuffs. My terms, Eleanor continued, her voice resonating with an authority they had never before witnessed, are as follows. I will oversee the federal contract's full execution and integration. My title will be Director of Federal Compliance and Strategy. I will report solely to the board, not to any single executive, and I will have complete autonomy in all matters pertaining to federal regulatory adherence and strategic development. My compensation will include a significant equity stake, proportional to the projected contract value, and a binding, explicit clause protecting me from any retaliatory actions or attempts to diminish my role. Furthermore, any future decisions regarding my employment will require unanimous board approval, with full transparency. She paused, allowing her demands to sink in, each word a stone reinforcing her new fortress of power. These terms are non-negotiable. If accepted, I will begin work immediately. If not, well, the audit will proceed as stipulated. The board exchanged desperate glances. They were caught. She hadn't merely secured a deal, she had seized the reins, redrawing the corporate hierarchy with a stroke of her own design. This wasn't just justice, it was a revolution, quiet and precise, executed by the unseen architect. The game had not ended, it had merely been reshaped, and Eleanor Vance was now the unquestioned master of its new rules.